The Arlington Hotel stood as a relic of the past, its grand exterior defying the quiet creep of decay within. Mark had worked the night shift for 2 years, lulled into a routine of midnight coffee breaks and the soft murmur of late-night check-ins. But this night was different. The sixth floor had disappeared again. It wasn't the first time the floor had vanished from the hotel's system. Mark had noticed it a month ago, a clerical anomaly, he had assumed. But as the weeks passed, the floor's absence became an irregular visitor. Some nights, it would return, complete with reservations that no one seemed to make. Other nights, it was like it had never existed. Tonight, Mark stared at the screen, the eerie absence of the sixth floor unsettling him more than he cared to admit. The lobby was empty, the only sound the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock behind the desk. Sarah, the head of housekeeping, had dismissed his concerns weeks ago with her usual no-nonsense attitude. Old building quirks, she had said. But Mark wasn't so sure anymore. The phone rang. The sharp trill shattered the silence, and Mark jumped, his coffee spilling onto the desk. He grabbed the receiver, his hand trembling slightly. "Front desk," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Mark," the voice rasped. It wasn't a question. Whoever was on the other end already knew his name. The line crackled, and then, softly, "Room 606. They're waiting." The line went dead. Mark set the receiver down, his heart pounding. There was no room 606. Not tonight, not ever. But the phone call had triggered something deep and primal, a sense of obligation, of being pulled toward the unknown. He looked toward the staircase, its dimly lit landing seeming to yawn open, beckoning. The old hotel groaned as if in protest, the sound echoing down the empty halls. Mark took a deep breath, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped away from the safety of the front desk. Mark ascended the staircase slowly, each creak of the worn wood beneath his shoes amplifying the uneasy silence. The air grew heavier the higher he climbed, as though the building itself was resisting his ascent. The walls seemed to lean inward, their faded wallpaper curling like skin peeling from bone. He reached the fifth-floor landing and paused. A dim bulb flickered above him, casting long shadows that seemed to shift independently of the light. The sixth floor was just one flight up, but the thought of what might await made him hesitate. "It's just an empty floor," he muttered to himself. But even as the words left his lips, they felt hollow. Mark gripped the railing and continued upward. When he reached the top, his flashlight beam wavered against the door labeled 6. His breath caught in his throat. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness yawning from within. For years, the sixth floor had been closed for renovations, or so the management claimed. No one went up there, not housekeeping, not maintenance, not guests. Yet tonight, the door stood open, inviting him in. Mark pushed it open with trembling fingers, the door creaking loudly in the silence. The air inside was stagnant, tinged with a metallic tang that stung his nostrils. The flashlight's beam danced across the hallway, illuminating faded carpets and peeling wallpaper. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed by his presence. He took a cautious step inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a heavy thud. The sound reverberated down the hall, and for a moment, all was still. Then came the whispers. They started softly, an indistinct murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Mark swung the flashlight around, but the beam revealed nothing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and intertwining until they were almost deafening. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice shaky. The whispers stopped. A sudden sound echoed down the hall, a distant door slamming shut. Mark's flashlight flickered, the darkness pressing in around him. He forced himself to move forward, his footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The hallway seemed endless, the dim light from his flashlight swallowed by the oppressive gloom. As he passed a series of doors, he noticed something peculiar. Each door bore a brass number plate, but the numbers weren't sequential. Room 602 was next to room 610, which was next to room 601. The inconsistency gnawed at him, but he pressed on. Halfway down the hall, he spotted a door slightly ajar, a faint light spilling from within. The number on the plate read 606. Mark hesitated, his pulse quickening. The phone call echoed in his mind, room 606. They're waiting. He approached the door cautiously, the light from within flickering like a dying candle. The whispers returned, softer this time, as if urging him forward. Mark pushed the door open, his flashlight cutting through the dim interior. The room was empty. Or so it seemed. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing away from him. Its wooden frame was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to writhe under the beam of his flashlight. The walls were covered in a tapestry of mold and decay, and the floorboards creaked beneath his weight. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a gentle click. His flashlight illuminated the chair, and he noticed something lying on the seat, an old key, its brass surface tarnished with age. Beside it was a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Do not turn around. Mark froze, every muscle in his body tensing. His breath hitched as a cold chill swept over him, raising goosebumps on his skin. The room grew darker, the light from his flashlight dimming as though something unseen was siphoning its energy. Then he felt it, a presence behind him. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible weight in the air. But it grew stronger, pressing against him like a shadow made tangible. The whispers surged, louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled his ears and drowned out his thoughts. The urge to turn around was overwhelming, but the note burned in his memory, do not turn around. Mark gripped the key and stumbled backward toward the door, his eyes locked on the chair. The presence behind him seemed to shift, the air growing colder with each passing second. He fumbled for the doorknob, his trembling fingers finally finding it. With a desperate twist, he flung the door open and stumbled into the hallway. The whispers sto. The hallway was empty, but it was different now. The wallpaper was pristine, the carpet lush and vibrant. The air was warm, almost inviting. It was as though the sixth floor had transformed into a perfect replica of itself, one untouched by time. But something was wrong. The doors lining the hallway were open, and from each room, figures began to emerge. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking as though controlled by invisible strings. Their faces were featureless voids, smooth and expressionless. Mark's breath quickened as he backed away. The figures moved toward him in unison, their heads tilting as though studying him. He turned and ran, his footsteps pounding against the carpeted floor. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, the exit nowhere in sight. The figures followed, their movements slow but relentless. Mark's flashlight flickered, the darkness closing in. He stumbled and fell, the key slipping from his grasp. As he scrambled to pick it up, he felt a hand grip his ankle, a cold, unyielding touch that sent a jolt of terror through his body. He kicked frantically, breaking free and sprinting down the hall. Ahead, a faint glow appeared, a door at the end of the hallway, its frame outlined in golden light. Mark pushed himself forward, his lungs burning and his legs threatening to give out. He reached the door and threw it open, the light engulfing him. The whispers ceased, and the figures vanished. Mark found himself back in the lobby, the sixth floor behind him. The clock on the wall read 3:33 a.m., the soft ticking a soothing reminder of reality. He collapsed into the chair behind the front desk, the key still clutched in his hand. The phone rang. Mark stared at the phone, the shrill ring slicing through the eerie silence of the lobby. His hand trembled as he reached for the receiver, hesitating for a moment before lifting it to his ear. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The line crackled, static filling his ear. Then, a voice emerged, low and distorted as though coming from a great distance. "You took the key. It's already begun." Mark's heart raced. "Who is this? What do you mean?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the static grew louder, a relentless hiss that seemed to burrow into his mind. Just as he was about to hang up, the voice spoke again, its tone colder this time. "You have until dawn to return it." The line went dead. Mark slammed the receiver down, his breathing uneven. The key felt heavier in his hand, its surface colder than before. He set it on the desk and stared at it, his mind racing. Return it? To where? To what? A noise from the staircase made him jump. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps on carpet. He turned toward the stairs, the lobby dimly lit by the flickering chandelier overhead. The air felt heavier again, the oppressive weight from the 6th floor creeping into the space. Mark grabbed his flashlight, its beam flickering uncertainly as he shone it toward the stairs. The light caught a shadow, a figure standing at the top, its shape obscured by the darkness. "Who's there?" Mark called, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the lobby into darkness. Mark fumbled with it, shaking it frantically until the light returned. The figure was gone. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away, his eyes darting around the lobby. He felt the oppressive presence again, this time closer. The air grew colder, his breath visible in the faint light. The phone rang again. Mark didn't want to answer it, but the sound was unbearable, each ring cutting through his nerves like a knife. He picked up the receiver, his hands slick with sweat. "You don't have much time," the voice said, sharper and more urgent now. "They're already coming." "Who's coming?" Mark demanded. "What's going on?" The line went dead again. Mark slammed the receiver down, the sound echoing through the empty lobby. He grabbed the key and pocketed it, determined to find answers. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop until he confronted it head-on. Mark decided to head back to the 6th floor. It was the only lead he had, the only place that seemed to hold the answers he desperately needed. He grabbed his flashlight and started up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The climb felt longer this time, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the 6th floor, the door was shut. The brass number 6 gleamed faintly in the dim light, as though mocking him. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly. The hallway was different now. The vibrant carpet and pristine walls from earlier were gone, replaced by a decayed, crumbling version of themselves. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic, blood, perhaps. Mark stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating the same endless corridor. The doors were closed this time, but faint sounds came from behind them. Whispers. Scratches. Quiet sobs. The key in his pocket felt heavier with each step, pulling at him like a lead weight. He reached room 606, the door slightly ajar. The light from within was gone, replaced by a suffocating. Mark hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he couldn't. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for the chair in the center. But something was different. The walls were covered in symbols, scrawled in a dark, dripping substance. They pulsed faintly, as though alive. The chair was no longer empty. A figure sat in it, their back to him. They were shrouded in shadow, their form indistinct. "Return the key," the figure said, their voice hollow and echoing. "Before it's too late." Mark gripped the key tightly. "What is this? What's happening?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, they turned their heads slightly, just enough for Mark to catch a glimpse of their face, or what should have been a face. It was a void, a swirling mass of shadows and light that seemed to consume everything around it. Mark stumbled back, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. The figure rose from the chair, their movements slow and deliberate. "You." The room began to collapse, the walls folding inward as the symbols pulsed violently. Mark turned and ran, the hallway stretching endlessly before him. Doors flew open as he passed, figures emerging from the darkness, their fetu. He reached the staircase and stumbled down, the figures following in silence. The air grew colder, heavier, each breath a struggle. When the whispers returned, softer now but more insistent. They seemed to guide him, pulling him toward the clock. He approached it cautiously, the key trembling in his. There was a small slot in the clock's base, just big enough for the key. Mark hesitated, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The whispers grew louder, urging. With a deep breath, he inserted. The clock's hands began to move, spinning wildly before halting precisely at dawn. The oppressive weight lifted, and the lobby filled with an eerie, calm stillness. The suffocating darkness receded, replaced by faint, golden light filtering through the dusty windows. Mark staggered back, his knees buckling as he collapsed into the chair behind the desk. His chest heaved as he caught his breath, sweat trickling down his face. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. Then he glanced at the staircase. The door to the 6th floor was wide open. Mark's pulse quickened as he stared at the open door to the 6th floor. The golden light in the lobby flickered, as though whatever calm had settled was a fragile veil over something far darker. He wanted to believe it was over, that the nightmare had ended, but the sight of that door, yawning open like a hungry maw, told him otherwise. The clock behind him ticked loudly, each second reverberating in the quiet. Slowly, almost against his will, Mark rose to his feet. His legs felt like lead as he moved toward the staircase, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. The lobby felt colder with each step. He could see his breath again, curling into faint wisps as he reached the first stair. A deep, resonant sound, like the distant tolling of a bell, echoed from above, sending a shiver down his spine. "Don't go," he whispered to himself, but his feet kept moving. The climb was agonizingly slow. The staircase seemed steeper, the steps endless. With each one, the air grew heavier, thicker, until it felt as though he were walking through water. By the time he reached the top, his lungs burned and his vision swam. The door to the 6th floor was different now. The brass 6 was gone, replaced by a jagged carving that resembled an eye. It seemed to follow him, its etched pupil shifting as he approached. The whispers returned, faint and disjointed, overlapping in a symphony of dread. Mark hesitated at the threshold. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white, and peered inside. The hallway was not as he remembered. The walls were pulsating, as though alive, and the floor was slick with something dark and glistening. The air was filled with a low hum, almost like a heartbeat, and the faint glow of symbols etched into the surfaces cast an unnatural light. At the far end of the hall, a door stood ajar. Golden light spilled from within, stark and unnatural against the crimson hue of the corridor. The whispers surged, their tone almost pleading now. "Don't let it out," they murmured, over and over. "Don't let it out." Mark's body moved on its own, each step dragging him closer to the glowing door. The hum grew louder, the pulsing of the walls synchronized with his pounding heart. By the time he reached the door, his vision was blurred, his thoughts fragmented. He pushed the door open. Inside was a room unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were smooth and reflective, their surfaces alive with shifting patterns of light and shadow. The golden glow emanated from the center of the room, where a pedestal stood. On the pedestal was a box. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, and covered in intricate carvings that seemed to move and writhe like living things. The light pulsed from within, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Mark felt a pull toward the box, an overwhelming compulsion to touch it. His hand trembled as he reached out, his fingers brushing the cool surface. The moment he touched it, the room erupted in chaos. The light flared blindingly bright, and the whispers turned into screams, high, piercing, and filled with despair. The walls trembled, the shifting patterns collapsing into jagged, chaotic shapes. Mark staggered back, shielding his eyes, but he couldn't look away. The box began to open. "No!" Mark shouted, his voice lost in the cacophony. He stumbled forward, trying to push the lid shut, but it was too late. From within the box, darkness poured out, thick, viscous, and alive. It swirled around the room, consuming the light and filling the air with an icy chill. Mark fell to his knees, his breath stolen by the freezing void. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall and featureless, its body a mass of shifting shadows. Its presence was suffocating, a weight that pressed down on Mark's chest and made his vision blur. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their words incomprehensible but filled with terror. The figure moved toward him, its form rippling like smoke. Mark scrambled back, his hands slipping on the slick floor. "What do you want?" he managed to choke out. The figure stopped, tilting its head as though considering him. Then it spoke, its voice a deep, resonant echo that filled the room and Mark's mind. "You brought the key. You opened the door. Now you must pay the price." The darkness surged forward, enveloping him. Mark's scream was swallowed by the void as the world around him dissolved into black. The Arlington Hotel was quiet again. The lobby was bathed in the soft light of dawn, the clock ticking steadily as though nothing had happened. The staircase was empty, the door to the 6th floor firmly shut. Behind the front desk, the new night receptionist, a young man fresh out of college, settled into his chair. He glanced around the quiet lobby, his eyes lingering on the staircase for a moment before shrugging and pulling out his phone. The clock ticked on. And somewhere in the hotel, deep in the shadows, the whispers began again. Jason was scrolling mindlessly through his phone when the landline rang. He jolted, startled by the sudden sound in the stillness. Setting his phone aside, he answered. "Front desk," he said, his tone practiced and professional. There was a pause on the other end. Then, faintly, a voice spoke, "Welcome to the night shift." Jason frowned. "Who is this?" The line crackled with static, and then the call disconnected. He hung up, chalking it up to a prank, but unease settled in the pit of his stomach. Something about the voice, its cold, detached tone, lingered. He glanced at the clock. 3:33 a.m. The time sent an involuntary chill down his spine. A soft knock echoed through the lobby. Jason looked toward the front door, but it was empty. The knock came again, this time louder. It wasn't from the door, it was from inside the hotel. His eyes flicked to the staircase. He stood slowly, unsure whether to investigate or ignore it. The knocking grew insistent, a steady rhythm that seemed to reverberate in his chest. Grabbing his flashlight, Jason approached the staircase, his footsteps hesitant and quiet. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaking slightly. "Is someone there?" The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, a voice drifted down the staircase. "Help me." Jason froze. The plea was faint, almost childlike, and filled with desperation. Against his better judgment, he began to climb. The air grew colder with each step, the golden light of dawn fading behind him. By the time he reached the 6th-floor landing, the flashlight in his hand began to flicker. The door was ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling out. Jason pushed it open. The hallway was as silent as a tomb. The air was heavy, filled with the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. His footsteps were muffled by the threadbare carpet as he moved deeper into the corridor. At the end of the hall, a single door stood open, room 606. Jason approached cautiously, his flashlight casting long shadows that danced unsettlingly across the walls. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as though dozens of voices were murmuring just out of reach. He stepped into room 606. The room was empty save for the pedestal in the center, bathed in a faint golden glow. On it sat the box, its carvings alive with shifting patterns. Jason's flashlight faltered, the beam dimming until it was barely a glimmer. He moved toward the box, his body compelled by a force he couldn't explain. As his fingers brushed its surface, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then the door slammed shut behind him. Jason spun around, but the room had changed. The walls were gone, replaced by a vast expanse of darkness. The box pulsed with light, its rhythm matching the frantic pounding of his heart. "Jason," a voice said, low and resonant. He turned back to the box. The light spilling from it coalesced into a shape, a towering figure with hollow eyes that burned like embers. It loomed over him, its shadow swallowing the remaining light. "You've joined the cycle," it said, its voice vibrating through the air. "The door must stay closed. The key must remain hidden. And now, you are the keeper." Jason stumbled back, shaking his head. "No, this isn't real. I don't." The figure reached out, its hand brushing against his chest. A searing pain shot through him as the box's carvings etched themselves into his skin, glowing faintly like a brand. "The clock will tick," the figure said. "The whispers will call. And when another takes your place, you will be free." Jason's vision blurred, the room dissolving into darkness. The last thing he saw was the box's light fading as the figure stepped back into the shadows. Jason woke up behind the front desk, the morning sun streaming through the windows. The clock ticked steadily, its hands pointing to 6:45 a.m. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream. But when he looked down at his chest, he saw the faint, glowing carvings etched into his skin. The phone rang. Jason picked it up, his hand trembling. A familiar voice greeted him. "Welcome to the night shift," it said, before disconnecting. Jason set the receiver down and looked toward the staircase. The door to the 6th floor was firmly shut, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way. The whispers were already starting again.